r/NoSleep. I hired a ventriloquist to perform at the retirement home, but he had a set of rules we shouldn't have broken. I'm sitting here, watching the security footage over and over again, trying to make sense of what happened last night. It's playing on a loop in my head, even when the screen goes dark. I don't know if I'm more terrified of what I saw or the fact that no one else seems to think it was strange. Maybe writing this out will help. Maybe someone will read this and tell me I'm not insane. Let me back up. I work at Golden Pines Retirement Home as the Resident Engagement Coordinator. It's a fancy way of saying I'm in charge of planning activities and events for the residents. Most of the folks here are kind but frail. They've lived long, interesting lives, and now they're winding down, looking for something to keep them occupied while they wait for, well, you know. It's not an easy job. If you've ever tried to entertain a room full of people aged 80 and up, you'll know what I mean. Bingo is always a hit. Anything involving soft music? Great. But try to introduce something new, and you're met with a wall of skepticism. I once brought in a caricature artist, thinking it would be fun. Instead, the residents complained about how offensive it was, and one of them called me a Satanist for good measure. So, when I heard about Mr. Grin and Chester, a ventriloquist act that had been performing at retirement communities across the state, I jumped at the chance to book them. The reviews were glowing, engaging, delightful. Brought the room to life. The contact information came from a flyer another retirement home had shared. It felt like a godsend. But there were rules. When I called to book Mr. Grin, the voice on the other end was odd. It was high-pitched, like someone trying to mimic a cartoon character. They introduced themselves as Chester, the dummy. Mr. Grin doesn't do contracts, the voice said. He doesn't like paperwork. But he has rules. You'll follow them, or the show won't happen. Understood? Sure, I said, already regretting the decision a little. What are the rules? There was a pause, and then Chester rattled them off quickly, like he'd said them 1,000 times. 1. Mr. Grin must perform in complete darkness except for a spotlight on the stage. 2. Do not interrupt the performance. Once the show starts, no one enters or leaves the room. 3. Do not touch Chester. Under any circumstances. 4. When Mr. Grin laughs, the audience must laugh with him. 5. Do not, under any circumstances, look directly at Mr. Grin during the finale. I laughed nervously. Is this part of the act? Just follow the rules, Chester said, and the line went dead. I should have cancelled right then and there. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I was desperate to finally host an event that wouldn't end with complaints. Maybe I was just curious. Either way, I booked Mr. Grin and Chester for the following Friday. The day of the performance, the residents were more excited than I'd ever seen them. I had set up the common room as requested, with a single spotlight focused on the small stage. The rest of the room was bathed in shadow. It felt wrong, but I shrugged it off. Mr. Grin arrived about 30 minutes before the show. He was tall, painfully thin, and dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Chester, the dummy, sat slumped under his arm. Chester was unsettling. His face was painted in exaggerated colors, a wide red mouth, rosy cheeks, and eyes that looked too real, like they'd been stolen from a corpse. "Thank you for having us," Mr. Grin said in a voice that was too smooth, too practiced. "Shall we begin?" The show started normally enough. Mr. Grin's voice was impeccable, switching between his deep, velvety tone and Chester's high-pitched, squeaky one. The jokes were corny but funny, and the residents seemed to love it. For the first time, I thought I'd actually nailed it. Then, about 15 minutes in, things started to change. Mr. Grin told a joke, and Chester laughed, a high-pitched, piercing cackle that made my skin crawl. The residents laughed along, as instructed. But the laughter didn't sound right. It was too loud, too synchronized, like the sound was being dragged out of them. I glanced around the room and noticed something strange. The residents' faces were slack, their eyes unfocused. They weren't just laughing, they were convulsing, their mouths wide open, like puppets on strings. I tried to move, to go to the stage and stop the show, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. My body refused to obey me. "Are we having fun yet?" Chester screeched, and the residents laughed harder. Their laughter turned to choking gasps, but they couldn't stop. Mr. Grin turned his head slowly, his too wide smile fixed on me. "You're not laughing," he said, his voice cold and sharp. I forced a chuckle, and my body relaxed slightly, just enough to keep me upright. The spotlight dimmed, and the room grew darker. Chester began to sing, a slow, haunting melody in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick, heavy. Shadows danced along the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the light. Then came the finale. Mr. Grin stood perfectly still as Chester's head began to turn. Not just left and right, all the way around. The dummies painted on Grin grew wider, impossibly wide, until it stretched across his entire face. "Don't look at him," I whispered to myself, remembering the rules. But curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up, and immediately wished I hadn't. Mr. Grin's face had changed. His eyes were black voids, and his mouth, it was no longer a mouth. It was a gaping, endless hole, filled with writhing shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe. Chester's head snapped toward me, and his glassy eyes locked onto mine. "You broke the rules," Chester said, his voice low and guttural. The spotlight flickered, and the room erupted into chaos. The shadows came alive, twisting and crawling over the residents. Their laughter turned to screams as the shadows seeped into their mouths and eyes, consuming them. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was in the room, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air. The common room was empty when I went back, save for a faint smell of sulfur and Chester's broken dummy lying in the middle of the floor. The residents? They're still here, but they're different. They shuffle around the home in silence, their faces blank. They don't eat, they don't talk, and they don't sleep. At night, I hear faint laughter echoing through the halls. I don't know what Mr. Grin and Chester were. I don't want to know. All I know is that I broke the rules, and now I have to live with the consequences. If you ever come across a ventriloquist named Mr. Grin, don't hire him. Don't even talk to him. And whatever you do, don't break the rules. That's where I thought my story would end. A cautionary tale to pass on to others, a horror I'd try to forget. But I didn't get that luxury. Whatever Mr. Grin had started wasn't finished, and I was about to find out the hard way. The first sign that something was wrong came the night after the performance. I was sitting in my office, trying to write up the incident report for management. What could I even say? "Dear Golden Pines Administration, the residents were attacked by shadows after a haunted ventriloquist act. Sorry about that." No, I decided I'd keep it vague and hope for the best. The room felt too quiet. My little office is tucked away in a corner of the building, and usually, I could hear the muffled sounds of the residents shuffling around, the television in the common area, or Julio chatting with the nurses. But tonight, there was nothing. Just silence. I shook it off and turned back to my computer. As I typed, I became aware of a faint sound, like the creaking of wood. It was rhythmic, steady, and it was coming from behind me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Slowly, I turned my chair to face the room. Nothing. Just the same cramped office filled with paperwork, a filing cabinet, and a corkboard covered in pinned memos. But the sound didn't stop. It was louder now, like something wooden was being dragged across the floor. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The creaking stopped. I exhaled and turned back to my desk, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the building was settling. Old places like this always made strange noises at night. But as soon as I started typing again, the creaking returned, louder, closer. This time, I didn't turn around. My instinct screamed at me not to look. Instead, I reached for the small desk mirror I kept for quick checks before meetings. Angling it just slightly, I caught a glimpse of the room behind me. There, standing in the doorway, was Chester. The dummy. His head was tilted to one side, his painted-on grin twisted into something that looked far too human. His eyes, those horrible, lifelike eyes, stared straight at me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Chester's head jerked forward slightly, his wooden neck creaking as it twisted unnaturally. He raised one tiny, jointed hand and pointed at me. "Rule breaker," he whispered, his voice barely audible but cutting through the silence like a knife. I screamed, shoving my chair back so hard it toppled over. When I turned fully to face the doorway, Chester was gone. The room was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car, parked in the lot outside Golden Pines, with every light on and the doors locked. But the shadows outside seemed darker than they should have been, and every so often, I swore I saw movement in my rearview mirror. By the time the sun rose, I was questioning my sanity. The next day, things got worse. The residents weren't just quiet, they were vacant. Their expressions were blank, their movements robotic. They shuffled around aimlessly, and when I tried to engage with them, They didn't respond. Even Carl, who never missed an opportunity to complain, stared through me like I wasn't there. Julio was no help, either. He hadn't said much since the performance, and now he barely seemed to notice me. When I asked him to help move a box of decorations, he nodded but didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the floor. "Julio, are you okay?" I asked, waving a hand in front of his face. He blinked slowly, then turned to me. His eyes were wrong, glassy and unfocused, like the residents'. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "We broke the rules," he said. "Now we pay." "Pay for what?" "Julio, what are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just walked away, his movements stiff and unnatural. That night, I stayed late again, trying to make sense of everything. I pored over the security footage, hoping it would give me answers. What I saw only raised more questions. The footage from the night of the performance started normally enough. Mr. Grin and Chester took the stage, the residents laughed, and everything seemed fine. But as the show went on, the footage began to distort. The screen flickered, the image twisted. Shadows crept across the frame, darker and thicker than they should have been. And then, at the exact moment Del Prado blew his horn, the screen went black. When the video returned, the room was empty. The residents were gone, the stage was bare, and there was no sign of Mr. Grin or Chester. The timestamp showed that the footage had skipped forward by exactly 13 minutes. I rewound it, playing it over and over, but the result was the same. 13 minutes of darkness, unaccounted for. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. But as I sat there, staring at the frozen image on the screen, I realized the sound was coming from inside the room. Soft, low voices, murmuring just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it felt wrong. Like they weren't meant for human ears. Then, clear as day, I heard Chester's voice. "You shouldn't have looked, baby doll." I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as the lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Stop!" I screamed, clamping my hands over my ears. The lights went out. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in the darkness, I heard the creak of wooden joints. Slow, deliberate footsteps approached, each one echoing in the blackness. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. "Rule breaker," Chester whispered, so close it felt like he was right next to my ear. The light snapped back on. The room was empty. I left Golden Pines that night and never went back. I packed what little I could carry and drove until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I don't know where I'm going or what I'll do, but I can't stay in one place for too long. The shadows follow me. The whispers come at night. And every so often, I catch a glimpse of Chester's painted grin in the corner of my eye. If you ever come across Mr. Grin and Chester, remember the rules. But if you're smart, you won't let it get that far. Because some rules aren't meant to be broken. And some doors should never be opened.